Maybe I'll start with a little background. I must say I was reluctant to do this only because 50 years is a long time, and I think that the world was so different 50 years ago, and I really wonder if students will get much out of what happened. But there are some things I think I did well and some things I think I could have done better, and so I'll try to highlight some of those. I'll start with my family. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think I'm probably the luckiest person in the world in terms of the parents that I had. My dad was the 15th of 16 children. He only went to the 5th grade. And he moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Detroit, Michigan to work to find a job in the factory. And he made the round of all the auto plants at the age of 13. And back in those days, you had to be 18 to work in the plant. But he didn't get a full-time job until he was 16 years old. And he went to work at Chrysler from the age of 16, retired at 59. And think about, in fact, I was a college student. I got him to retire because I went through the retirement formula. And imagine not being 60 years old, but you have 43 years in one place. But where my dad was fascinating is he was very, very smart. And I knew many of the men he worked with in the plant. He's the only one that had a child who went to college, the only one. My mother wanted to go to college. Her dad would not let her go. He thought it was a waste of money for women. So she taught me to read and write before I ever started kindergarten. And I started kindergarten. I could read really well. I could write cursive, couldn't print, which they thought was odd. But my mother would ask me every day for the first 4 or 5 days, what did you learn? And she didn't like what she heard, so she came and took me out of the public school. And the next day put me in the Catholic schools. And so I had a great education from the start on. And it was always assumed I'd go to college. And my dad always said the key to a better life in this world is through education. So back when I was thinking about college, the Russians had put up a satellite called Sputnik. And it was a big cry for engineers. And I said, okay, I didn't know what to do. I said, I'll be an engineer. So I went to Wayne State. I got a BS in electrical engineering. And there weren't many African Americans. There was one in the electrical engineering. I was the only one. One in chemical engineering, we were the only two. When I graduated, I had a scholarship from Detroit Edison. I'd worked for Pontiac Motors, but I didn't like the work, but I couldn't figure out what else to do. And so I did the most illogical thing. I ended up at Cornell in a PhD program. And I was funded by NASA, I was doing research for NASA. And I would say I was maybe 23, or maybe 24, and it dawned on me, I could have a 30 or 40-year working career, something that I really don't want to do. But I knew I liked business, so I applied to HBS, and I got in, and I absolutely loved it. And it was difficult for me to tell my dad that I was going to come here, because his view was that all business was done in the country clubs and on the golf courses, and that I would be excluded because I was African American. And when I did finally tell him I was going to come, he said, well, he said, I only went to the 5th grade, so I don't know. He said, but John Kennedy went to Harvard, so I know it's a good school, and so I know that you'll learn. And I graduated, and I went to work for McKinsey, which I absolutely loved. But, again, not a great place where you want to start a family. So my wife and I wanted to start a family. I left. I went to work for Citibank, and I was chief of staff for Walter Wriston and Bill Spencer, who were president and chairman of the bank. And at that point, I went through a period where I was at the highest level staff job the bank had, and it was not a great next job for me. So I talked to Walter Wriston about what do I do next. And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I'd like to get into the mainstream of what the bank does, which was corporate finance. And then his response was, well, what do you need to know to do that? I said, well, the one thing HBS I thought did not do well as it could have done was teach accounting. So I was taken out of that job, and I went into an accounting course with all these young MBAs, and that's where I truly learned accounting. And then I was put into a department lending to the broadcasting and cable TV industry, and that's where my love of corporate finance came. I then did that for a number of years, and I got approached to become treasurer of Allied Corporation, which was in Morristown, New Jersey. But we decided, they said, we'd like you to go to our oil and gas subsidiary, and it was the largest independent oil and gas subsidiary in the U.S. I was treasurer for a year. Then my boss, who was the CFO, said, I'd like you to take the controller's job. And I said, I absolutely don't want that job. I said, I think that the work's not interesting. I don't think the people's interesting. I don't think it's something I'd want to do. Now, I would say that the one great thing that was with me through my whole career is I loved what I did. And when you love the work you do, you will do a better job, and you'll be much more strategic at what you do. And he kept pressing me, and I wouldn't agree to do that job. So finally, the CEO of the company called me in. He said, Bob, he said, you are not promotable unless you do that job. He said, I'm going to put you in whether you want to do it or not. So I came home, my wife and I talked about it, and she always worried about me. She always worried that I was going to be badly treated. And she said, you're the only African American in senior management. I think you should quit. I think you should find another job. And I said, well, no, let me try it. I'll see. It turned out to be a fantastic job. And I learned I could not have done virtually anything that I did after that without having done that job. I participated in a class today, Professor Foley's class, about CFO. And I talked to them about how being treasurer or controller is a typical route into that. And students today think about that. Back then, I wasn't. All I was thinking about was I loved what I did. So I did that job for a year. Then I was promoted to CFO of the oil and gas subsidiary. And I had done that for a year when Allied decided they wanted to sell the company. Well, then the deal that was structured, they said, "Will you stay behind?" In fact, I was negotiating to move to Morristown, New Jersey, to become treasurer of Allied Corporation. And they said, "Will you stay behind and help us structure a sale?" And the sale restructure was to KKR. They bought half of the company. And so I had the opportunity. I spent probably 6 weeks in KKR's office in San Francisco preparing the operating memorandum. And every day I'd have lunch with the KKR team, and they would go around the table, and we'd all opine on the deals, and I was sworn to secrecy. Learned an awful lot. I got to know George, Henry, Jerry, all three, the KK and the R, and it was an unbelievable learning experience. Well, then after we'd done that, the issue became, how do you finance the leverage buyout? And George said, I want Bankers Trust to do this deal. Now, they don't exist today, but they were a big bank back then. And I said, Bankers Trust can't do your deal because you need to have your own petroleum engineers on staff to put together a syndicate. I said, they've had a couple of bad deals. They've laid off their petroleum engineers. There's no way they can do this deal for you. George said, I don't agree with that. He said, but you try who you think will do it, and I'm going to get bankers to do it. Well, it turned out Bankers Trust wouldn't do it, and I got J.P. Morgan to do the deal. George then said, well, will you stay behind and become an equity investor in leverage buyout? And I said, sure. And I thought, my wife was dying to leave Houston. She didn't like it. And I said, well, we'll just be here 2 years. And I viewed it as very much a financial, I thought I'd do well financially having done it. Well, we went out, we did a massive roadshow in the US, then we took the Concorde to Europe and did a roadshow all over Europe. We had stops in Asia. We put together the deal. It closed, oil prices were almost $30 a barrel. And experts were saying it'll get to 100. Well, in 9 months, we were selling oil at less than $10 a barrel. We laid off a third of the workforce, and what I thought would be 2 years turned out to be 8 years. And it was the most incredible learning experience. I could never have ever imagined the things that I would have learned. And so we went from restructuring, we went to selling assets, we went from making the company more efficient. We ended up doing an initial public offering. It was 8 years of incredible learning. And throughout all of this, what I think I did really well was I loved doing it and did a good job of it. What I didn't do so well was I didn't see the benefit of all the things that I did. Now, I think Jonathan mentioned that Bill George was the one that recommended, and I've never had anyone ask me about what I did during the leverage buyout. And that, I remember when I met Bill George, Bill sat down and he knew that he wanted to grow Medtronic. And he said, tell me what you've done as CFO. And I started walking through. I said, well, I don't have a resume or anything. Let me just do this year by year. And I got maybe a third of the way through. And Bill said, that's more than I've heard from anyone I've talked to. And so he said, so our discussions kind of went along. And I wasn't really wanting to join Medtronic. I wanted to take a couple of years because they were at a point where KKR, I think, wanted to begin to sell the assets and kind of wind the company down. And I said, I think I'll take 2 years and just not do anything. So I talked to Bill, and he tried to interest me in Medtronic. And I wasn't quite buying it. And he said, well, why don't you spend a couple of days with a Medtronic rep? And a Medtronic rep, you think of as a salesperson, but they really are. They're on call 24 hours a day. For 2 days, I went to the operating room, and I would stand as close to the patient, I mean, literally 2 or 3 feet away. And I'd scrub down, and I really began to kind of like the business, but still wasn't quite sure I wanted to do it. Then we had KKR and Allied. We had done, each of them we had done in a public offering. They each were down to 38% ownership each. Allied wanted to sell theirs, KKR wanted to stay in. So I worked with Goldman Sachs and I structured a deal where Allied could sell theirs if KKR would agree to a 2-year standstill. So then to do that, they needed me to stay as CFO to basically do another roadshow. And so I withdrew from consideration for Medtronic. And then Bill George came back and said, well, we haven't made an offer, but we're kind of moving in that direction. And if you're interested, we'll just stop the search for a couple of months, let you do what you want to do, and then we'll pick it up. And I'd say that more than anything else said something about the kind of company that Medtronic was and helped push me along. But I won't drag you through all the things that I did in my 8 years, but I knew every investment bank on the street. I knew every commercial bank. I'd worked with the rating agencies. I'd done public offerings, I'd done debt deals, I'd done equity. It was just such an incredible range of things, but I didn't really recognize the value of it until at a later point. So that's kind of an introduction. I don't know if you'd like me to take questions at this point.
Yeah, so just as a reminder to the folks that are joining us by the web, you can email your questions in to AASU50@hbs.edu, and we'll be sure to circulate those questions in to Bob.
Yeah, and I would just say some of the things that I learned, I think that when you don't want to shy away from tough businesses or businesses that that have tremendous challenge, because when that is the case, number one, that's a great learning experience. And number two, it causes the people who run the organization to focus on people who can get a job done, because you don't have the luxury of putting in someone who's not going to do the right job. And I think you know, and I don't want to say racism doesn't exist, because I'd have to be stupid to say that. It does exist, but you do have to understand that people work at what's in their best interest. And if you're going to do a roadshow that's all over the world, and you're trying to place a couple of $1 billion worth of assets, you've got to come with who you think is going to get that job done. And I can remember when I moved into the controller's job at Union, Texas, my thought was, hey, the guy's in this job as an accountant. I'm not a professional accountant. I'm not interested in it. But I brought a very different perspective, and I was really so well accepted by the people in the organization as well as management. So again, I think don't shy away from difficult circumstances. That's going to be a learning experience, and I think you're more likely to be treated well. I would also say that what you learn, and this is what I talked to the students about this morning, if you want to be CFO, now in today's world, young people like yourselves, you know, you can think about how to become a CFO and what are the things I need to know to get there. I did virtually all the things you need to do to be a good CFO, but not knowing at the time. I did them because they had to be done. But I think young people today, you can begin to think about that, and you can begin to think about how you position yourself to do that. The other thing that I've told a lot of African Americans is you need to try to find a mentor in an organization, someone that can give you good advice. And by good advice, I mean not just good advice, but also good criticism. Somebody who cares about you and about you in the organization and will give you they will tell you what you don't do so well so you can do that better. And I would tell you one anecdote. I came to Medtronic maybe 20 years ago. Well, I came here to HBS to recruit for Medtronic. And I recruited a guy named Chris O'Connell who ended up coming. He was one of 2 or 3 people I identified that I wanted to hire. And Chris now runs the Water Company, which is a company here in Massachusetts. And I'll never forget, he came in to see me one day and he said, Bob, he said, you're much the reason I came to this company. And I consider you to be my mentor. And I didn't get it till he walked out. He didn't say, will you be? He said, I consider you to be. And it was as if he had handed me something and I had accepted what he handed me without realizing that I had accepted it. And I began to think differently about him because I had a position in investor relations that I wanted, and I ended up coming back to him for that. So my point being that's you need to think about that, and I think you need to find people who will care enough about you to be critical of you. So maybe I've rattled on a bit. Maybe now we'll see what questions I can answer. Yeah. Yes?
So you said that management wants to put people in places that know how to get things done. Mm-hmm. So how did they know that about you? Because it sounded like fairly early on you were forced to be the controller, you were given these roles. How did that happen? What did they see in you?
You know, I think they have to look at how you deal with things, how you deal with people, how you deal with issues. And I give you an example. When I was with Union, Texas, and we did the initial public offering, I mean, every single year we had a crisis. And when we decided to do the initial public offering, this was really, it was what they call Black Monday, which happened in 1987. This was when the stock market crashed. And we, back in that time, KKR and myself and Allied, we sat down and interviewed all the investment banks, and we were absolutely convinced that the stock was going to go out at $26 a share. And so we put together a roadshow. We did a massive roadshow here in the U.S. Then, and it was traditionally, first Boston was our investment banker. They don't even exist today. And we took the Concord to Europe and did a massive roadshow in Europe, then took it back to the U.S. to basically for the very last day. The 8 or 9 or 10 days that we were in Europe, the market got worse and worse and worse. And what we thought would be a $26 deal, the deal got done at $14. And we sat down at the end of the day, and Allied and KKR were both going to sell some of their shares, and they said, this is a price that we don't want to sell our stock. We think it's worth more than that. But we decided to put stock out at that value to reduce debt. And George Roberts used to have a saying, if the money holds, luck will follow. And what George was saying was, let's make sure that the company exists. And if we have to take a deal that's not an optimal deal, let's take it to survive. And so we did that. So after we closed the deal, I got a call the very next day from a guy. He said, Bob, my name is Dick Grasso, and we're assigning Marcus Schloss and Company as your specialist. And I had no idea what a specialist did. I knew nothing about him. And I did a little bit of reading, and I called Marcus Schloss, and I said, I want to come and spend a week with you. And I said, I'm on the floor of the stock exchange for a week. And that's how I learned all about what the stock exchange does. Well, then and I'm answering your question in a long-winded way to say that I think they were looking at the way I did things and the way I got things done. Then you fast forward a lot of years later when Bill George wanted me to come to Medtronic. Well, Medtronic is a company that had more cash than debt. They had not much in the way of bank relationships. They didn't have much in the way of investment banking relationships. And I actually introduced George to Hank Paulson, who was in my business school class, who at the time was the CEO of Goldman. And then George went on to become, Bill went on to become a director of Goldman. And so we had a time when, the first thing I said to Medtronic when I joined, if you got plans to grow, you never know when and where you're going to have to raise money. We're a global company. You want to have equity investors all over the world. We had no equity investors outside the U.S. And so I said, what we need to do is every year, once a year, do a roadshow where you go out, and the time to acquaint people with your company is when you don't need money. So that when you do need money, then they are there to know. So we saw, and I remember coming into the company, and the head of investor relations was a guy named Dale Beamer. And Dale said, you know, I've been in this job for X years, and I don't want to do it anymore. And I said, well, you don't know what changes we'll make in it. And so we went to Europe, and I remember the first year that we went to Europe, I remember we had a meeting at the Bristol Hotel in Paris. There were like less than a dozen people there. Nobody knew a pacemaker from a defibrillator. They didn't know anything about the company at all. We did that every year for 4 or 5 years, and when finally Medtronic needed money, we went back. There were 200 people in that, and much of our equity was raised outside the U.S. So again, I think they just look at how you do things, and they look at, you can be a finance person, and I said this to the students earlier today, who knows what the rules are, but you also, the way the world of finance moves, is you partner with business and you help them get things done, but get things done the right way. Yes?
You mentioned the importance of having a mentor that will give you good advice and criticism. Can you talk about your most memorable advice and criticisms you've received from mentors throughout your career?
Well, I can tell you, when I first joined McKinsey, you'd be on a team, and I was the only African American that would be out to meet with a client. And you could just tell that they wanted to know, well, why are you here? And they were just waiting for an opportune time to say, well, tell me your background, or tell me why you're on this team, or tell me. And that could make you, early on, it made me kind of draw back a little bit. And it took me a while to figure out, and it makes you afraid that you'll say something stupid and that people will remember it forever. But then it took me a while to conclude that, hey, yeah, but you may say something, and I'd sit there and people would say something, and I'd say, I thought of that 5 minutes ago, but I didn't say anything. Right. And after a while, I began to say, I could say something smart, and they'll remember that too. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that I have nothing but downside, you also got upside. And so if you do say something that's insightful, something that adds value, then you begin to build a reputation for yourself, and people begin to see you differently. But it took me, and what made me do it is one of the partners sat down with me and said, you're too quiet. You don't say enough. I think you've got things that you don't bring out. And what I have noticed over the years, and I think it's better today than it was, but sometimes I think things have changed. Sometimes I wonder if they've changed as much as I think they have. But you will get people who will be a little reluctant to tell an African American to give them straight advice for fear they don't want to hear it, or for fear that they'll quit, or for fear that they'll say, well, this person had an African American working for them, they drove them out of the company. So therefore, they'll kind of sugarcoat what they tell you. And if you're not hearing it, what will happen is you'll look at the people in the company who are your peers, people that came in when you did, and if you see that they're moving ahead faster than you are, then your conclusion, well, I think it's racism. Well, sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And I go back again to my thing at Union, Texas. My wife always worried that I was going to be mistreated. And we were kind of the opposite in that respect. There were problems that I tended not to see, and she saw every problem that there was. And so, things that could appear to be racism, maybe were not. And I saw in retrospect that the guy who was controller before I took the job was not very good at it. He was technically very good, but there were a lot of other things that he didn't do that were very well, that I brought a whole different perspective to the job.
You mentioned about things that the technical things that the controller did that were well, but weren't necessary for the job. So my question is, what qualities did you exude that helped distinguish you from your peers, and how does the importance of those qualities change from as you move from the entry level positions to the C-suite?
You know, within Medtronic, we have an organization called the FLDC, it's Finance Leadership Development Council. And what we do is we tell, in the old days, you'd come into a company, and if you had all the technical expertise, then that's what got you to the top. And today, that's not true anymore. You've got to partner with the business. When I joined Medtronic, the guy who was controller, I ended up having to terminate. And the reason for that was he would say to people, you can't do that because the rules say this, and you can't do that. And I would say to him, that's not how you deal with people. You've got to say to them, what is it you're trying to get done? And then you work from there. And then after and the guy that I replaced him with, that's how he functioned. Then you get to the point where if he would say, well, you can't do that, people didn't question it anymore. They would know that that was an honest view, but he would say, you can't do that, but tell me what you want to get done. Let's figure out what we can do. And so it's working with people to get things done, which will differentiate you. And so what we did is we laid out for people, we laid out 3 phases in your career. The early phase being technical knowledge, the second phase being to work with people who can make change, and the third phase being able to lead change. And what I told Professor Foley's class today is if you look at CFOs today, what they do is so much the same as what a CEO does. I mean, you know, for example, when I talk about one of the things I did at Union, Texas, when I got the call from Dick Grasso, we didn't have an investor relations organization, and I had no idea what investor relations did or how it should do it. So I had to learn of what is the buy side, what is the sell side, how do you work with portfolio managers, how do you work with the securities analysts, and you know, you work through all of that. And if you're really strategic, you can learn so much from other people if you ask questions. And if you know, you can't come in saying I know it all. You've got to come in saying, let's focus on this, and you've got to know where you're trying to get to. Yes.
I've noticed that you mentioned your wife a couple of times in the talk, and it seems like that you've also had a very rewarding work career as well. Could you maybe speak to how you balance like that work and family life?
I think today younger people are doing it better than I did. My son he lives in New York, and he has 2 boys, and he has decided that he is going to raise his boys in the city, so he doesn't have all this long commute. So when I worked for Citibank, I lived in the town of Hartsdale, near White Plains, and I commuted every day. I know people who commuted 3 hours a day. Now, what I did for the work balance was not all that easy. Whenever I was in town, I always made a point with our children to give them baths every night and to read books to them. And I didn't, over the weekends, learn to play golf or anything because I didn't want to be gone all day Saturday, all day Sunday. And so they were pretty much, I won't say totally mine, but a lot mine on the weekends. But there's a downside to that. I mean, I had a job to do, and there are times that I'd be under stress, but I always did the baths and the books. If that meant I got up at 3 o'clock the next morning to work, that's what I did. So I ended up being sleep deprived, and at times I'd sit in a chair and I'd go to sleep, and then I sat down. But you know, you got to work it out some way. Now I like what my son is doing, where he's saying I'm not going to do all that commuting. I'm going to live in the city. I'm going to raise my boys where I can get home at a decent hour and see them every day. But it's not easy. And I would tell you, you know, the other thing I would say I learned from my dad was very, it's been with me my whole life. He was one where he sat me down I used to think he was a mean person when I was a young kid. And he sat me down as a young person. He said, I want to tell you something. I have a job and you have a job. He said, and you can't do your job unless you know what your job is. And I want to tell you, your job is good citizenship grades and good academic grades. So if I'd come home and I'd say, well, this grade wasn't what it should be, or that, I don't want to hear it. He said, you figure it out. And I never could understand why he didn't want to hear what I had to say. But then I fast forward when we'd have to do these road shows or we'd have to go out meeting with investors. And we always would have 3 speakers. The CEO would be a speaker, the chief operating officer would be one, and I would be one. And I typically had the most pressure because the CEO would say, he'd get up and talk in broad terms about the strategy, and then he'd say, well, if there are any detailed questions, Bob will answer those. So, you know, you were always, and the people you're meeting with are financial people, so I was always under the gun. And he'd come in and say, well, Bob, are you ready to go? And my answer was always the same. Do I have a choice? and I think he asked me to hear that. It was my job to be ready, and I had to do it. And I think HBS is a place where, for me, being an engineer, I have 2 degrees in engineering, you were into just infinite detail. And I had to make a transition when I came here because I did every single case incredibly well from September to Thanksgiving. And by Thanksgiving, I was so tired when I went back to visit my family. I slept through almost the whole vacation, the whole Thanksgiving. And I came back and I said, I can't do work. I'll never survive this program that way. So I learned how to work with other people and how to leverage it. And that was a great learning experience for me. And I also learned, I think the school does a great job. I think a lot of the technical things you can learn if you're willing to put in the time and ask the questions. But I think with the education you guys get here, you can add a strategic element to it.
Bob, one of the things in your career, you give us a great example of excellence.
Right.
And we joined in with some of the folks through the Alumni Association. And there are points in their careers where they're also committed to excellence, but also trying to figure out how to make sure that they get a fair shake or good piece of the pie. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to do that through your career and how to negotiate that, given sometimes people, when you're presented with opportunities or offers, and you're given a short amount of time to make a decision, or you have to...
Well, you know, I don't know that I ever had to, I mean, the first time that happened was when they asked me to become the treasurer, the controller in Union, Texas. And I just said no. And they said, you're going to do it anyway. And I really thought long and hard about quitting. But once I got into the job, and I'll tell you, it was interesting. Allied owned the corporation, the company. We were the largest, we were like 70% of Allied's earnings and cash flow. And the CEO of Allied was a guy who wasn't all that particularly good, but he had these blind rules. And one of his blind rules was, I'm going to be the first company in the Dow to report earnings. Well, the oil business was such that you couldn't, the cycle was such that we were kind of lagging. So what they did is they put in a system where they would close the books with estimated earnings. Then you would figure out the gap between the estimate and the actual, and you'd roll that forward the next month. And I never knew how the auditors let that happen, because that was such an awful thing to have done. But, and I came in and I said to the group, this makes no sense. We got to figure out a way to deal with that. And so we actually corrected that and found ways to make it work. So, you know, and I just got pulled from one job to the next. And then when I went to leverage buyout, I had the same job for 8 years. And so, but every single year it was different. And every year, 1 year I got responsibility for insurance. And again, I don't want to drag all these details out, but it was very interesting. I thought, I know nothing about insurance. So I said, let's do a big study. And my whole point was, let's cut our insurance costs. Are we over-insuring? And we found 7, 8, 9 opportunities to cut our costs, but we found one opportunity that we could get increased coverage at no cost. We had insurance in the platforms of the North Sea. And we had business interruption insurance, which was for a given amount or 18 months. And we concluded that if the platform were out, you couldn't recover it all in 18 months. So I said to the Lloyd's underwriter, well, could you just make it 36 months? They said, oh, sure, and they just changed it. Well, then, you know, we signed this in April, and you fast forward to like August, and I'm sitting in the dentist chair, my wife calls and says, well, they're calling you from the North Sea. And I say, well, I think probably a compressor's out or some problem. I get home, I find that the whole platform was destroyed. We were not the operator, but we owned a third of it. And 200 people lost their lives. And we were the only company in it that were insured from loss of wreck, paid for death, and were compensated for loss of earnings over the 36-month period. But it was just, you know, every year was something that you just never knew would happen. So I wasn't really looking for jobs. I was never looking for, as you say, a piece of the pie. And then when Medtronic came along, I went into Medtronic as the chief financial officer, and that's what I did for 13 years. But it changed a lot over 13. I mean, the company grew by a factor of 15. And Medtronic had, and I was compensated just fine, because one of the things that we did is you could take your compensation in cash, or you could take it in terms of stock options. So if you gave up $1 of income, the way it was set up, you got $4 worth of options. And so I had a number of years when I had no compensation. I just took options instead. And so that was never an issue for me.
I have a question, because you referenced a few times how you've not necessarily gone looking for jobs, they just happen to have found you. And given quite a few of us here are still quite early on in our careers, and given how turbulent a lot of industries are, how did you actually plan out what skills that you needed to acquire and develop as you were progressing in your career. You know, without falling into the trap of saying, I'm going to develop these skills only to find they're not relevant, or the job that is perfect for you that you don't know of, it doesn't match.
Well, I thought the discussion that we had today with Professor Foley's class was a good way to think about it. And this is the third time I've done that. And this time I did it a little bit differently. I started off with, let me tell you what a controller does, and let me tell you what a treasurer does. And then I kind of sort through them all. And you come out of it saying, these are very technically complicated jobs. And so you talk about if you want to become a CFO. And what I tried to get through was, what does a CFO do day to day? So then what I said was, okay, the way you could think about it is you could come in with either treasury or you could come in with controller and really learn one, but then begin to learn the other. Or you could come in and then you could move into a function, you know, say you could be CFO of a division. So you talk about the skills that you need to get from here to there. And I think that but then what you have is you have technical skills, plus you have what I'll call other skills. I mean, for example, I took them through 7 things that a CFO would do. And I said, so for example, if you're a finance person in a business, one of the things you've got is company performance. Well, you ought to know right away in that business if there's a performance problem. And you don't just walk into the CEO's office and say, okay, let me tell you what the problem is, let me tell you how big it is, and here it's in your lap, you deal with it. That's not what you do. What you do is you know that business, you know the strategy, and you know exactly why did you miss. And it could be missed that your strategy's wrong. It could be a lot of reasons. But you ought to have a point of view as to why you missed. You ought to have a point of view of what you would do differently to deal with it. And you want a recommendation when you go in and talk to the CEO. So those are the so it's not just the technical things. So again, in my view would be that if you want to be a CFO, now what I did, I came in through the route that would be the treasury, the financing route. But then I learned about control. I was dragged into it. But once I got into it, I said, boy, I should have wanted to do this. And then along the way, I learned how to deal with commercial banks, investment banks, rating agencies, and a whole host of other things. Yes?
Bob, you mentioned that your role today is more about leading change. Can you explain your approach to leading change within an organization and what makes it effective?
Well, yeah, I'm retired, so so I'm not in Medtronic now. But I think the way you have when Bill George hired me for Medtronic, what he said was, the company is going to grow, and I want to have all the resources and things that we need to grow this company. So I talked to you about outreach in terms of the financial community, letting them know what Medtronic did so that we wanted to raise money. I upgraded the staff so that you had the kind of staff to do the kind of work that need to be done. So you have to have a vision of where you want to go. And then you have to, with that vision, and again, when I came to Medtronic, it wasn't that difficult because I'd done a lot of the things that Bill George wanted done, but it was in a whole different environment. And I had to learn the environment. And I when I would meet with Medtronic investors, I would say to them, Medtronic has to be what I call the Wayne Gretzky medical device. Because Wayne Gretzky would say it's not where the puck is, it's where the puck is going to be. And I would say to investors, what Medtronic has to do is we have to invest today for what healthcare needs 3 to 5 years out. And then you have to lay out. And so in terms of my involvement in Medtronic strategy, you have to understand where is healthcare going. I'll give you an example. I have a good friend who is a cardiac surgeon. And he was with a team of cardiac surgeons in Minneapolis that were doing incredibly well. These guys were making a lot of money. And one day he bailed out and became a paid surgeon with Abbott Northwestern Hospital. And as his partners couldn't understand, why did he do that? Well, what he saw coming was that today, open heart surgery procedures, they call them CABGs, coronary artery bypass grafts, are down 80% plus. And now you're putting in stents, you're putting in drug-eluting stents. So, you gotta, I really loved Medtronic. I loved the work that they did, and I loved watching the improvements in healthcare from quarter to quarter. And so you get into that, and so once you understand the strategy, you combine that with your other knowledge, you can play a part in leading the organization.
Thank you.
But it's a strategic view. It's how you think about it. Again, I don't want to bore you guys with lots of detail, but and I'm not an accountant, but I had a case where I ended up testifying before the Senate Banking and Finance Committee, and it got to be a cover story on CFO magazine. And what had happened is that, this goes back before your time, but there was an accounting method called pooling of interest, where you take two companies, and if they're going to combine, you just combine their balance sheets. And as you know, accounting loves to write things off. And so what happens is you get company A and company B combined, then they take and they begin over time writing the assets down. And so a number of companies were opposing that. And so Bill George came to me and said, Bob, they've asked that someone from Medtronic testify, and I want it to be you. And I said, well, you know, this is a very technical accounting issue. And I said, so I want Gary Ellis, our corporate controller, to testify. And Bill said, no, I want you to do it. So I then said to Gary, okay, well, why don't you prepare what testimony you would give? And he did. And I looked at it and I thought about it and I said, you know, I would add to that something different. What Medtronic does is they have, in any given disease state, they'll have approaches they want to take to deal with that disease state. There may be other approaches that they maybe don't take, that they may invest in, or somebody else may implement, and they may step in and buy the company. So you'll get a company that takes an approach that's different than ours. It may turn out to be better. But then they get to a point where they can't get FDA approval, they don't have the resources to build a big sales organization, and Medtronic would buy them. So I made the argument that you have all of these things out there that are growing. If Medtronic acquires them, and then we have to begin writing them off, number one, you're writing down an asset that could actually be going up in value. So what what you're showing the world is not what's real, but it would also discourage us from buying companies like this. So this got a lot of attention. So they came back and said, it was a man named Ed Jenkins who chaired what they call the FASB, the Accounting Standards Board. And he said, let's make Medtronic a test case and figure out how to deal with this differently. And what they came out with was an impairment test, that if you acquire a company, that you look at the value of that company when you acquire it, and every year you go back and you assess that value. And if in fact the value is lower, then you write it down. And if it's not, you never write anything up, but you don't write it off. So it turned out that a small company, Medtronic we had much bigger companies than us testifying, and we led the way in getting this done. So my point being, it's just kind of a strategic overview of the impact of the accounting change.
Bob, can you tell us a little bit about what AASU has been to you over the years, either from your time in school or your time throughout your career?
You know, I was here when AASU was established. And I would say that from my point of view, I've not been super active with AASU, but what I have been active in, and I feel very strongly about people of color coming to Harvard Business School. So my wife and I have established a fellowship here. And I talked to Jonathan Schaffrath, who's in development, yesterday, and he said it's helped about 25 students to date. So I feel very strongly about that. But I guess you could argue, and I probably would say that I probably should have been more involved with AASU. But again, you know, between work and family, it's just, you know, my family is, I just want to absolutely sure that it's done well. So.
Well, we obviously appreciate your stewardship.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your time with kind of coming out of the, you talked about coming out of the leverage buyout, taking some time off. How did that conversation emerge with your wife, and how did you all kind of weigh that? And did it seem risky at the time not to be doing something immediately?
Well, I'd be the first to tell you that many of the decisions I made, if I had done what I thought I was going to do, would have not been a smart decision. And I just said, I'll just take a couple years and just not do anything. Now, my wife did not like Houston, was ready to go. She was ready to move. And when Medtronic came along, my option was, maybe I won't do anything. And I don't think she was crazy about having me at home either. She thought I would be meddling in what she's doing, which she, there's a lot of wives like to say that I want you home, but not for lunch and advice. So I think she wasn't keen. But again, Bill George really, Bill George really pushed, and I think I told you what he did that really made me feel good about Medtronic. And to me, an important aspect of this is the people that you work for. And to have the CEO of the company really want you to come and really go out of his way to treat you fairly, it was also a big factor. And plus, I began to really like the business. And I've probably been in the operating room 100 times, and that's the one thing that I miss more than anything about Medtronic. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it seems like Medtronic, you learned a lot from Medtronic because it was a growing company.
Mm-hmm.
What is your perspective or advice for people early in their career with going to like a startup or a company that's growing versus going to a well-established company to understand how to do the job really well?
You know, a startup can be a great place to go if you're the right personality. I mean, you know, if you're a person who wants to come into a job that's all structured and you know exactly what you're going to do, a startup is not the place for you. But if you're the kind of person that will come in and can form relationships with the people at the very top of the startup, and you can talk the same language, and you can agree on what needs to be done and how it should be done, and then your role in it, startups can be just great. But you got to have, and what I tried to say to Professor Foley's students today, you got the technical requirements, but as time goes on, businesses, especially in finance, are saying, we're going to take it for granted that you know the technical aspects. And we're going to take for granted that you're going to keep us out of trouble and we're going to do all the right things, but we have all these other things that we want you to do. And I tried to say to the students, for example, that if I was kind of the face of Medtronic to Wall Street, so Bill George had to be absolutely sure that if I went out and talked to a bunch of investors, that I'm not going to say something dumb or something wrong or something stupid that he's got to repair. So again, you've got to have that same kind of relationship in the startup. But I think the other thing I would say is I have found so many people who can't stand uncertainty. And uncertainty can just paralyze people. And especially people like you guys who are young, who have such great opportunities. Again, some of this is your personality. But if you're a person who can stand uncertainty and do something and you think it's the right thing to do, but you're not 100% assured of the outcome, a startup can be a great thing for you. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah.
Can you talk about how your perspective has changed about your life over as you've kind of gone from managerial roles to executive roles to governing roles? Has there been do you look back over the career with a different lens, now having spent more of your time at the governing role for large companies versus being the person executing on a daily basis?
Well, I would say the one thing, when I went to business school, when I came to Harvard Business School, I felt like I'd been let out of prison because when I look at what you do as an engineer, it's great work, but it just didn't fit my personality. And I was reconciled to the fact that work was to earn a living, and that's all it was for. And one day I just began to think about it. I said, you know, I don't want to have a career where for 30 or 40 years I do something that I'm going to hate. And it was very interesting. And I knew my dad, he had told me, he said, look, there are three things you look for in a career. Number one, where you make the most money. Number two, where you have the greatest job security. And number three, the least amount of racism. And I knew he was going to think business was a terrible, terrible choice. And there was an article in the magazine section of the New York Times, and it talked about Harvard Business School and the class session and the case method in defending your point of view. And I'd been accepted. I still hadn't told my parents I was going to come. And I sent them this article. And my mother read it, and she said, boy, this sounds like an awful place. She said, it sounds very cutthroat. It sounds like the students are all at each other. And you know, she's thinking of a nice, collegial environment. And I finally told them I was going to come. But I absolutely enjoyed it. But as I look back on my career, I would say I was so happy because I did things I liked doing. I think I added a lot of strategic value to what I did. I probably could have, I could have maybe been more aggressive. I think I might have liked operations or managing a business. But I didn't really push or pursue that, but I was so happy with what I did. But that's another thing I could have done. The other thing that I look back on is, since I retired from Medtronic, you have time to read other things. I was at a Citibank board meeting, and one of the directors was talking about the decline of the U.S. And the guy who actually ran the bank talked about a man named George Friedman, who started a strategic think tank called Stratfor. And he's written some books that are really fascinating. And one of them, he believes the U.S. is on the cusp of 100 years of world dominance. So whether you agree or not, it makes you think. And it's made me think a lot about the world. I think having grandchildren makes you think about the world. And I think that there are tremendous issues in the world. And I think that we've got a growing gap between the have and the have-nots. I think, as we've seen, racism in this country is not, it's been easily reignited. So there are a lot of things that I think about. And Sharon and I are trying to support causes that deal with those things. But nothing more than education for people of color.
The things that you think that our community should be doing with that education, especially the business education, that weren't available, over the last 50 years. I guess as you think about the next 50 years of ASU and what that community and what your gifts to help bring students of color here to study. What do Were there things that you can imagine or dream that maybe you didn't
What I would like to do would be to see people of color, women, people, all minorities, people who don't have a seat at the table today, to come in and really have a sense of confidence that you can contribute and that you're not intimidated by anybody, and you can add strategic value, you can add value that gives you the place that you ought to have. It took me a while to get there, but I do think I'd like to see that more.
And for alums that are watching, maybe at different parts of their career, where they're thinking about wanting to be a C-level executive, and they see that there are fewer folks of color in those C-level ranks, at least for the Fortune 500, what perspective would you impart, given where you sit and having been, being in the governance level, understanding that those conversations play out and the idiosyncratic nature of it that maybe is not appreciated when you look at the optics?
I think more than anything else is you've got to have confidence in yourself. I mean, I think, again, the discussion that we had with Professor Foley's class, anyone in that class who wants to be a CFO would be way ahead of what my thinking would have been 50 years ago about the ways you could go about doing that. You could come into an organization as a treasurer, or you can come in as a controller, and if you're a controller, then you could say, boy, I want to learn about treasury, I want to go into a business, and you begin to think about the things that you can do to advance you to where you want to go. And once you get there, and I will tell you, I do have this belief that if you go into a big, stagnant company that's not going anywhere, your opportunities there are going to be very different than a company that's got tough things to get done. I mean, if you got things you got to get done, and I'm looking at you and I say, well, this guy isn't all that good, but his color's okay. Whereas this guy, I may not particularly like his color, but he'll get the job done. You got to be stupid to pick the person who's not going to get it done, because if they don't get it done, it's going to come back to you. And I've always felt, and I've said this to my children, you can't. I don't care about whether somebody happens not to like African Americans or feels that they wouldn't want their son to marry my daughter or vice versa. All I care about is if I'm treated fairly, and if I get the opportunity, the other stuff I just don't want to get involved in.
Well, we have time for one more question.
I mean, you spoke about confidence. I often find that even in the discussion group, sometimes in the classroom, that there is a sort of lack of confidence. How did you get over that gap? You said you started, not as confident, not as outspoken, but then after a period of time, you started to speak more. You started to. Well,
a McKinsey partner sat me down, and he told me. He said, he did it very interesting. We had to interview a client, and he just said, "You do the interview. No coaching, no nothing." And then at the end of it, he critiqued me, and it was devastating. And he said things like, I'd go in and ask a very pinpoint question. And then, and he said, that's not the way you interview. He said, you ask a very broad question. And let there be pregnant pauses. Let people come back to you. And ask and answer questions to make them amplify what they've said. He said, so I'm going to do the next one. And then I'll discuss it with you again and have you do another one. And so, more than anything else, what you feel in that case is this is somebody who cares enough about you doing well to give you negative feedback. And I have said so often to people of color, I went back to Medtronic after I retired, and they said they wanted me to talk. They had the African American sales force group. They'd formed a group. And what I said is, you've got to reach out and seek, find someone who is going to give you negative feedback. It's so easy for people not to give it to you. And I'll say what I said before. I have just my observation over time is that companies want to recruit African Americans. So when they get them in, people can be very afraid. I don't want to be said that I ran this person off. So therefore, you'll get a kind of a watered down performance appraisal. And the monkey has to fall on your back a bit to push to get an honest appraisal, and to really let a person know that your goal is the same as theirs, and that you can help really meet that goal by them giving you honest feedback, and that you're open to it, that you want to do it, that you will deal with it. Because if you don't say that, they're not going to know. And I think this is a burden that a white person would not necessarily have to bear in a corporation. But the reality of the situation is that it is what it is, and if that's what you have to do to get honest feedback, then that's what you should do.
Well, I would like to thank you for your example, and thank you for coming out and allowing us to kick off the celebration for AASU50. Again, the conference is taking place in April 20th through 21st, 2018. We'd also like to encourage any of the alumni that are out there, if you're not members of HBS AAA, to please join. And then also, if you have feedback or suggestions, as we have future calls, webinars, please do pass along to the AASU50 at hbs.edu email address. But Bob, thank you so much.
Okay. It's a privilege to be here. I do wonder if someone who's been out of school for so long can be relevant, but we'll.
You certainly are, Bob.
But I do appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now the important thing is I got to go buy some things for my grandchildren.